Hey, everybody, this is Brant Frost with Georgia Caucus. Hope you're doing well. I'm here today with Dr. Joseph Postell, Associate Professor at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. Dr. Postell has a fantastic resume. He's Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Colorado. As I said, he's also the author of 3 excellent books, which are all available on Amazon. I recommend you look at Rediscovering Political Economy, Toward an American Conservatism, a very interesting book about the 1920s, and has recently published a book, Bureaucracy in America, the Administrative State and American Constitutionalism. He also frequently contributes at the Liberty Fund's Liberty of Law and Liberty website on political thought and legal issues. Dr. Postell, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. I wanted to talk with you about the paper you wrote just a few months ago for the Heritage Foundation entitled The Rise and Fall of Political Parties in America, and some of the prescriptions you recommend to fix these problems are very much like what we've been doing here in Georgia for the last few years, trying to educate folks as to the need for, as I like to say, greater quality control of our Republican elected officials. So tell us a little bit about, first, if you wouldn't mind, what prompted you to study this issue? It's a kind of a niche subject.
Yeah, so, my work up until a few years ago had always been about the problem of bureaucracy in America and how bureaucracies in this country have accumulated an enormous amount of power to the point where Congress does a lot less lawmaking than federal administrative agencies do, that most laws today are made by unelected bureaucrats rather than elected representatives. And I was really interested in that problem, and I wrote a book about it that you just cited in your introduction. And then, as I was sort of teaching political science at the University of Colorado here in Colorado Springs, I was assigned to teach a course on political parties. And so I just had to learn the subject really well in order to teach it. And I realized something along the way as I was learning about the subject, which was all of the things I thought about parties were completely wrong. And actually, the things that I had presupposed were happening with political parties, the opposite was actually happening. And so it sort of dawned on me after I'd taught the course for a few years that this was something that very few people understood and that I needed to start writing about and studying more carefully.
Well, excellent. Is that course available anywhere, the syllabus or transcript or any kind of audio or video?
Unfortunately, I just teach the class, and I don't think anybody records it or anything like that, or maybe some of the students do, but I don't know. I don't know whether they have the recording still. But this paper that I wrote for the Heritage Foundation, in some ways, is a good summary of my entire lecture notes. If somebody had asked me to take all of my lecture notes and all of the material we talked about in that class and summarize it in, a relatively brief paper, it would be this paper that I wrote for Heritage. So I guess that's kind of a place where I would start. But if anybody wants to get in touch with me and learn more or get some more from me about that, I'd be more than happy to do that.
Well, excellent. And you have a very significant internet profile, so it would be very easy to find you online. And you have contact information at your page at the university, so that should be easy for them to reach out to you. Also, I'm curious, in your study of the political parties and how they've evolved from the original caucuses where they were the congressional members of the Democratic, Republican, then just the Republican Party, they were called the Jeffersonians and the Federalists, and then it evolved to conventions and then to primaries. In your study of that, did you notice any correlation between greater participation by the voters in the transfer to a primary versus the conventions, and a greater adherence to the platform of the party? In other words, the theory is the smoke-filled room reflects the wishes of a couple of wheeler-dealers, but if we have the primary, the people will speak, the people will decide, and it'll be better. But the platform of the party is the creed of the party. Did you notice a greater adherence to the party creed once and a respecting of the will of the people who write that platform once we moved to primaries, or did you see it become more about the personal desires of the elected official? I know that's kind of a long and leading question, but basically, is there any correlation between greater democratic institutions and political parties and a greater adherence by the elected officials to that party's platform?
I would say the correlation is almost in the opposite direction, which is that the more you move away from conventions and into primaries, the less the platforms matter. So it used to be in the 19th century when we had a convention system, the platforms were the most significant part of political elections. That the candidates mattered a lot less than the platforms did, because you could assume that the platform told you everything you needed to know about who to vote for. And today, nobody reads platforms. There's a great illustration of this in 1996 when the Republican candidate Bob Dole was asked about his party's platform, and he confessed that he had never even read it. And the reason he didn't read it is because he didn't have to. He got the nomination not through the party, but through his own campaigning in the primary. So, in a sense, Bob Dole is the platform of the Republican Party, not the platform itself that had been voted on at the convention. And so the reason for this flip is that when you move to a primary system, people who get the nomination of the party, they aren't really indebted to party leaders or to party delegates for that. Nobody thinks that Donald Trump owed the Republican Party delegates or the Republican Party leaders anything when he got the nomination, and therefore why would he care about what the party's platform is? He gets to decide what to do rather than having to take cues from the party. So I think the answer to your question is that the more we move to a system where candidates get nominated on their own rather than through a party, the less the party platform is going to matter.
Well, that's very interesting, and it mirrors my thinking and my own reading on the subject. If you think back, those of us who are history buffs, you think back to 1860, perhaps the greatest example of, like you say, the platform being the key thing. They voted on the platform first, and historians have traced that decision by the Democrats in 1860 to vote on the platform first instead of the nominee as one of the biggest mistakes in American political history, because they debated the issue of slavery and the expansion of slavery into the territories so much that it caused such a schism that the party broke up after that, and the northern faction nominated Stephen Douglas and the southern faction nominated John C. Breckinridge. But can you imagine today any party splitting into two conventions over a platform issue? I mean, first off, they don't even let the delegates debate the platform. It's decided in committee, and it's just adopted on a voice vote. It'd be hard to imagine a time like that today. But also, you say some of the key takeaways from your paper in the executive summary was that the political parties are critical mediating institutions that help the American Constitution function well. I think I'd like to hear you unpack that a little, because the even traditional conservative understanding of the Constitution is that the Founding Fathers thought parties were terrible and that they warned against them and they made no provision for them. And the way the Constitution is structured almost presupposed there wouldn't be any parties. Like the way that the presidential election was set up, it almost invited a regional-based congressional election, because they assumed that the states would pick their own candidates and that the top five would have to go to the House of Representatives, and it never seemed to occur to them, if you just read the Constitution without understanding context, that there would be cross-regional parties, that people from New York and South Carolina could get together behind mutual interests. It seemed like they were thinking this would be an entirely state-based effort. Could you unpack that a little? How are parties a mediating influence and complementary to the Constitution, in contrast to what we've been told through the years?
Yeah, so we've just sort of mentioned one of the great myths of the idea of parties in the founding, which is that the founders hated parties. They never would have subscribed to the idea that we have them in this system or that people should be loyal to them. That's only true if you look at certain founders at certain times, saying, if you cherry pick some quotes here and there, you can construct that narrative. But if you look at the experience of the founders, they engaged in party conflict, they joined parties, they founded them, all that. And I think the reason for that is, this gets to your question, is that the Constitution needs them. they didn't really know it at the time that they created the Constitution, because some of these things needed to be solved by experience, how the system worked, and they would learn from that experience. But eventually they realized that political parties are these really important mechanisms for filtering public opinion in a way that's going to produce a government that's responsive and that doesn't sort of succumb to the kind of geographical or sectional conflict that you just described, right? That the idea of a party would be, you would take the wishes of the people, and then you would have people deliberate and discuss these opinions in some sort of formal organization like a party, so that the representatives would follow the wishes of the people. And I think there are two ways in which parties help the Constitution be responsive. The first is by just filtering out sort of the harmful effects of public opinion. What I mean by that is that sometimes elections can be about ideas, and sometimes elections can be about personalities. In political science, we always say, like, the two factors that determine the outcome of an election are ideology of the voters and the effectiveness of the candidates. Sometimes that's why you get a representative who's not necessarily in line with the wishes of the voters, but who, just because of their popularity, sort of can do things that the voters don't necessarily approve of. And so the problem, though, with these candidates who are elected not because of their ideas, but because of their personality, is that you don't really know what the voters have voted for. Like, you don't really know if the voters selected Donald Trump or Barack Obama because they agreed with those policies that those candidates promoted, or whether it's just because they liked them, because they promised to shake up the system or, their image in some way. And so parties would serve this function by filtering out the candidates' personalities and making the elections more about the principles expressed through platforms. So that's the first way in which parties, I think, help the Constitution function well. They make elections about principles and not about, the candidates themselves. And the second way is that parties allow for coalitions to be built on broader principles than just the interests of a small portion of the population. So if you have a party that is strong, it brings people from all parts of the country together, very different interests. There might be agricultural interests in one part of the country, there might be shipping interests and commercial interests in another, and it forces them to work together on the principles they agree upon once they get into office, so that they can pass legislation that's good for the whole country and not just a part of it. So this is a long-winded answer, but basically what parties can do is, first of all, build national coalitions that are for the public good rather than for a specific interest. And secondly, they make elections about principles and policy rather than candidates' personality and popularity. And those are really important things for a Republican government to have. And I think parties are the best way, and perhaps the only way, that you can get those things from our system.
Well, that's excellent thought, and this is something which is definitely needs to be discussed more. And I think the recent election here in Georgia, we started this effort after 2012, when I realized how the people who made our party successful, the activists, the volunteers, the people who went out and got the guys elected, virtually none of them that I knew wanted Mitt Romney to be the Republican nominee for president. And yet their wishes, and also the wishes of the majority of the voters, were not even being taken into consideration when you consider how Romney won, I think, 36% of the vote before Super Tuesday, but got 59% of the delegates. So in anything like a proportional or representative understanding, he would not have been the nominee. But this system of winner-take-all primaries and a continued ignoring of the caucus and the conventions resulted in him being the nominee. In fact, they cracked down after the election. I don't know if you recall, but after 2012, because of the success of Congressman Ron Paul in using the existing rules to get his people elected as national delegates, the RNC put in rules to basically abolish the non-binding caucus, so that there would never be another insurgent campaign like Congressman Paul, who, he didn't cheat. He used the existing rules like everyone else could, but they didn't want another insurgent campaign come along. Of course, they could never predict Donald Trump at that point. But again, I can say from personal experience, having worked in that campaign in 2016, President Trump used his incredible media persona and ability to get people out to vote to win that election. In terms of the party, organizers, at least in Georgia, they were the overwhelming majority favored Ted Cruz. He was far better organized on a grassroots delegate counter level. So if he'd have gone to Cleveland in the convention model, then he would have certainly been the nominee. But we talk about those forces, and I'd like you to also, if you would, talk about what has happened when parties are weakened. Now that they're hollowed out, you write that their role is now filled by an unelected, apolitical administrative state. Would you unpack that a little? How do weak political parties lead to the bureaucrats taking over?
Yeah, so I think most immediately, the reason that this happens is because the function parties used to serve in the 19th century was reinforced by their role in carrying out government programs. So the most prominent example of this that we all kind of are familiar with is Tammany Hall. And one of my students tells me that Gangs of New York is a film that kind of illustrates this very vividly, that political parties used to sort of do the work of building the social safety net in cities. And George Washington Plunkett, a great sort of party leader of the late 19th century, sort of vividly describes this in a set of lectures that he gives about parties, where he says, I'm the person who's there to help somebody out when a fire burns their house down, or I'm the person that helps somebody get a job when they come to this country. And the idea here was that parties had all of these resources, and they had the opportunity to put people in government positions and to use government to help them out. We think of that today as corruption, but actually if you go back and look at what the parties actually did, they played a really important role in just making sure that the government was relatable to the people, that it was populated by common people, that it was carrying out the wishes of the people. And the idea, of course, was that it wasn't based on expertise, it was based on politics. Today we have the completely opposite view of how government's supposed to work. We don't think that anybody's supposed to get a job or get a benefit on the basis of their relationships with other people. Instead, they're supposed to get these things based on some sort of neutral criterion or some idea of expertise. Well, the problem with that idea is that now you've got a government that's populated by sort of expert bureaucrats who are actually not accountable to the people. And, that essentially weakens parties. It makes them irrelevant to actual governance. So that's the most immediate thing that happens. In short, you just replace the idea of patronage appointments and the carrying out of social programs by parties with the idea that a bureaucracy is supposed to do this. And that's better because it takes the politics out of this. But then more long-term, I think, the only way that you can have a legislature that's active and that is making important decisions on behalf of the people is to have parties that do the work of building discipline and loyalty inside the legislature so that you can get a majority to enact legislation. The problem with weakening parties is you end up weakening Congress, or you end up weakening a legislature. Because now, instead of a bunch of people tied together by party loyalty, you have a bunch of individuals who got elected on their own individual basis. And therefore, when they get into a legislature, they fight instead of compromising, and they pursue their own interests rather than pursuing the interests of the people. And so you basically get a gridlocked legislature. And as soon as you have a gridlocked legislature, the executive comes in and starts making decisions unilaterally. And that's the long-term effect of weakening parties, is you get a really, really strong presidency or a strong executive that says, well, these people over here in the legislative branch, they can't coordinate their actions at all. They can't get together to do anything. But we need action, and therefore I'm going to step in and take control of the situation and make these decisions. And that's happened with both Republican presidents and Democratic presidents over the last century, as Congress has become less influential in actual policymaking because parties are so weak in Congress. Now you just have basically an executive government. And so we are in this situation because parties have been hollowed out. We often think of the presidency as way too strong, and especially if we're sort of dedicated to the Constitution, we want to rein in the executive, but we fail to see how parties can help us accomplish that mission.
Excellent. Yes, I've looked at that is an excellent point, and we know from real world experience how when you have this under this current system, you have this gridlock, but the only time that you see genuine bipartisanship is when either the establishment joins together and both parties to do something that no one likes in America, like the bailouts of 2008, or when people like, say, a Ron Paul or a Rand Paul get together with a Dennis Kucinich or a Ron Wyden on an issue like the Libya war or the surveillance state, basically when what is supposedly the far left and the far right join together on an issue where they share a common concern. That's real bipartisanship. In my experience, principled conservatives and progressives are far more likely to be able to pass the work together than the so-called moderates. This is true in the legislature here in Georgia, and I think it's also true in Washington. And if the parties had more control, then you would see more principled people being elected in both parties. The grassroots today in America of both parties are, their darlings are Bernie Sanders on the left and Ted Cruz on the right. And you would see more and more type of people like Cruz's and Sanders and Rand Paul's and Mike Lee's getting elected, and also people like Congressman Tulsi Gabbard out in Hawaii, who's a very bipartisan, principled progressive. And you would see more cooperation along areas of agreement, and where they disagree, you'd have a clear choice, and whichever party won would be able to implement their vision, their platform, because you don't have these people who are beholden to special interests. They got elected. That's an excellent point. Well, let's get to, if I may, and I will respect your time, you say that a renewal of the parties will be necessary to ensuring the renewal of self-government in the 21st century. It's a very, very strong statement there. How can the parties be renewed? If, as a delegate to the 2019 convention in Georgia, what should I be thinking about, and what should the folks listening be thinking about for how we can renew parties in America, starting in Georgia and then going nationwide?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've thought about this a lot because I do think, as that quote suggests, that this is really a fundamental question about whether our system is going to work effectively over the next century or into the future. I think there's a range of options from sort of more incremental reforms to pretty serious fundamental reforms. And I'll start with the fundamental reforms because I think those are, at least we should be considering them. And the most fundamental reform, I think, is changing the way we nominate candidates. We have this sense in America, and you referred to this in a couple of your questions, that the more democratic our system is, the better. And all we really need is just democracy. And anybody who tries to sort of take away pure direct democracy is, sort of taking away the basic principle of our system. I think that's a really flawed way to think about our constitutional system. As a lot of people who are dedicated to the Constitution like to say, we're a republic, not a democracy. We believe in representation, not direct democracy. And parties are a method of representation, that you elect people who then elect your representatives. And I think, one of the interesting things is that European parties, they nominate their own candidates, unlike America, where we have direct primaries, where we nominate the candidates and the parties play a secondary role. And so I think one thing we should think about is it's very ironic that Europe has less democracy than we do. I guess that's not, ironic so much as it is just it's an important lesson for us to learn. We should maybe consider giving parties more influence. Everybody hates superdelegates, but I think the 19th century worked when everybody was a superdelegate, was capable of deciding on their own which of the candidates was best. And I think if you look at the options we had in 2016, a lot of people would have liked if their party delegates would have had the freedom to select other candidates than the ones that got picked. So I think that's the first thing that we should all be thinking about. Can we actually return to a system where the conventions and the delegates to the conventions actually make their independent judgment, have the freedom to decide which candidates are the best. If that sort of fundamental reform is not really something we're willing to go for, there are a couple of more incremental reforms I think would be really important. And the first has to do with campaign finance, which we haven't talked about at all yet, but basically we have a campaign finance system that favors independent spending by political action committees and individual candidates raising money from donors. And really the parties play very little of a role in collecting money and raising money and then spending money on advertising. And I think one of the things we should consider doing is changing campaign finance laws to give parties more influence over raising money and spending it, because then at least the parties would be on equal playing field with all of the interests, the special interests in funding campaigns. And I think that would be a reform I would really promote to people who are looking to strengthen the parties again, is let them just be equal to the political action committees in terms of raising money. Take away the caps on what you can give to a party and what the caps on what a party can spend on a race. I think that would be a really important reform that could help a lot.
Absolutely. And if we were looking to strengthen the parties, we should undo the mistakes of McCain-Feingold and the unhappy side effects of Citizens United, and perhaps say that you can give unlimited to parties or perhaps to a candidate, but not these super PACs and such. I've talked to several people, and over the last few years, as we've seen how big money interests in both parties, the sort of mono party of the establishment left and right, has dominated Washington these many years. I think there's more support than you would suspect on the right for some kind of campaign finance reform and public financing of elections. We, for example, the left, the Bernie Sanders types, they love that. But on the right, we're always suffering from a chronic lack of funding because our principled candidates will not, sell out their principles for the donors and the special interests. But you think about it, we on the right, though most of us support public financing of education. Now we favor it through most of us favor it through vouchers and schools and tuition tax credits. But the concept that the taxpayers should fund a basic level of education for children is something which is supported by, I would say, at least 90% of the population, left and right. So it's not like this is an extraordinarily radical idea that if you can raise, say, 10% of the money you will need to run for office, that 10%, that the other 90% you put down a deposit and the rest will be covered by public financing of elections. And this will help to even out the playing field by giving candidates who are fighting the establishment, fighting the machine, a chance to actually be competitive. Now, of course, if we had conventions, that whole issue goes away because, as you say, it costs so much less. Well, you didn't say that, but our listeners will be very familiar with that point, that conventions are extremely cheap, which is another issue of concern. People are so worried about, you could probably speak to this, the issue of campaign finance reform is something which only has come about over the last 40, 50 years since primaries took off in such power. I don't know if there's a causation there, but when elections cost so much money and you have to buy a seat in Congress for a couple $1 million just to get the nomination, it costs $1 million most places to get the nomination nowadays. You are in hock to a lot of powerful people because unless you're extremely well organized, you're not going to be able to raise that money in $10 and $20 and $50 and $100 contributions. But that problem goes away in the conventions if you nominate with the convention.
Yeah. So I think you're right that there's a strong correlation. I think there are multiple factors that have caused the problem of money in politics. Part of it is just the rise in media itself, which I think has caused some of this. But I think you start to see the problem of money in politics as soon as we move to a primary system, because one of the most insightful people who talked about this problem was William Howard Taft, who most listeners I'm sure are familiar with. He almost loses his nomination as an incumbent president to Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, and he writes this really interesting set of lectures afterwards where he says, in the old system, the party could get you elected, meaning that once you got the nomination, all the infrastructure was already in place. All the volunteers were already part of the party. They'd been there with the party for a long time. So you had all the door knockers, all the, the precinct walkers, all the voter lists. You had everything you needed to get elected. You didn't have to go raise a bunch of money in order to put that infrastructure in place. But once you have a primary system, most of the candidates don't have an infrastructure until they build it because they're building their own infrastructure. So that requires an enormous amount of money so that you can basically sell yourself to the public instead of the party, which has already sold itself over decades to the public, not needing to build that infrastructure. So I think, you see two problems then as a result of these primaries. First of all, you are in hoc, as you just said, to a lot of very powerful and wealthy people just to get your name out into the public. And that's going to come back to haunt you when you have to make a decision once you get elected. And secondly, I think, the other problem associated with this is simply that it changes the kinds of candidates that you get. So normal people, I always ask my students when I teach parties, how many of you plan to run for Congress? And very few of them ever raise their hands. And if you ask them, why don't you want to run for office? Why don't you want to get involved in public service? They almost always say, people like me can't get into the system. There's a point here is, if you have to raise an enormous amount of money to get elected to office, you've essentially changed the kinds of candidates and elected officials you're going to get. You're either going to get wealthy people, or people who are famous, or people who are willing to do the things necessary to become wealthy or famous quickly. And the Republican form of government we have is not really a great form of government to run if those are the only people who get elected. So I think a lot of these reforms would really help us get better candidates, both to choose from during an election and afterwards, people who are willing to follow and promote the public good, rather than the interests of the people who help build their infrastructure.
That is an excellent point, and I've noted myself that the Republican Party, of which I'm far more familiar with than the Democrats, we like to say we're the party, both parties say they're the party of the people, but certainly the Republicans say we're the party of middle America, of normal people, and the Democrats are the party of the elites in Hollywood. But if you actually look at the Republican congressional caucus in both the House and the Senate, I'm not aware of a single normal average person in either the House or Senate Republican caucus who got elected who would be what you would call a normal average American, in the sense that they, A, weren't being sponsored by some powerful donor, they weren't very rich, they weren't already rich themselves, or they didn't already have a network. I mean, you think about the three most conservative and popular members of the U.S. Senate on the Republican side. You got Cruz, Lee, and Rand Paul. And you think to yourself, well, with these guys, they came up from the grassroots. Well, Mike Lee's dad was the president of Brigham Young University and Solicitor General under Ronald Reagan. Ted Cruz was Solicitor General of Texas and was matriculated under the Bush family in the 2000 campaign and built up a big network. And of course, Rand Paul, he inherited his dad's political organization. Now he's probably the least connected of the three, but still he inherits his dad's 30 years of networking and fundraiser list and donor list. That's not exactly normal. Most people don't have a dad who's been in politics 30 years and run for president twice. So and the same thing in the House of Representatives. I think the closest we had to it was a congressman from Michigan who was a reindeer farmer who was elected by a fluke in 2012. Congressman Thad McCutter had to get on the ballot again, and in Michigan you have to produce ballots. You have to get signatures to get on the ballot, even if you're an incumbent. Everyone has to get a certain number. And it turned out the company he hired did it fraudulently, and so he was disqualified. So this guy no one had ever heard of, Kerry Beneviglio, I believe is his name, older gentleman, a reindeer farmer, he got the nomination by default because he was the only other candidate running. But he promptly lost re-election 2 years later. Now, he voted very conservative. He was a member of what would eventually become the Freedom Caucus. I mean, he was the kind of guy that your grassroots Republicans around the country would say, yeah, that's a good guy. He's voting right. He was a Tea Party Republican. but he lost his reelection 2 years later. So the one normal guy in the Congress got elected by a fluke and was promptly voted out at the next election. If that doesn't tell you something's wrong with the system, I don't know what does. And your students are absolutely right. And I'll bet you when you kind of ask them more questions, kind of, what do you mean the system isn't for people like you? I'll bet you it almost invariably came back to, well, I don't have the money. My dad isn't rich. I'm not rich, and I don't know anyone who would give me the money to do it.
Yep.
Basically, we have the worst kind of aristocracy. We have an aristocracy of hypocrites, a nation that says it's about merit and the common man and founded on on Republican principles. We have a closeted aristocracy where they all pretend like they're just the normal guys, but they're not, and everyone knows it. But they really are, as opposed to an actual aristocracy, say in England, where the elites have to hold themselves to a higher standard because it's expected of them. I mean, if you compare the conduct of the English aristocracy, say at the high point of their influence in the Middle Ages, versus the conduct of our elites in America today, there's no comparison. The degree of corruption and banality in our modern elites is nowhere near, is just so much higher. And that would seem to be in conflict with the democratic narrative, right? The more, hey, we're a republic, we're a democracy, we should be the people. Well, no, not so much. So there's definitely a lot to unpack in what you've said, and I really appreciate the time you've given us. If I could, real quick, if you got just a few more minutes, I'd like to ask you a question about when you were talking about the era of good feelings. Folks may remember that from history class in high school. That was when basically the Federalist Party collapsed, and the Democrat and historians call it Democratic Republicans. They just call themselves Republicans. The Jeffersonian Party, the Jeffersonian Party reigned supreme, but they did so by drawing in the most talented Federalists and the most popular Federalist ideas into their party to become sort of a uniparty. And this era is supposedly the era of good feelings, where we had no parties and it was just one party. But in your research, you found that it wasn't this era of good feelings. In fact, it was extremely acrimonious. I hope I said that right. There's a lot of acrimony and division. Unpack that for us a little bit. What did you discover in that?
Yeah, so this is a great sort of illustration, even a foreshadowing of what would eventually happen in American politics. So this is during the presidency of James Monroe. He's sort of the last of the great, Virginia dynasty of presidents. So this is somewhere between 1816 and 1824. Basically, you have one party in the country, and it's really the only time in American history that's ever happened, outside of maybe the first several years when Washington kind of kept the country unified before parties had developed. And Monroe loved this idea that we would essentially get rid of political parties. He thought it was the best. In a democracy, you shouldn't have political parties. Everybody should be dedicated to the common good, and that means everybody agrees about the good of the people. And so, there's only one party, that is the popular party, the party of the people. And as much as that idea might have made sense in theory, it really did not work in practice. What you ended up with inside of Monroe's own presidential administration was essentially a bunch of sub-factions inside the one huge party that had now absorbed the other. And this led to all kinds of problems that Monroe himself eventually identified as he's leaving office in the later part of his second term as president. He says, nobody knows who the next president is going to be. This party is so big and has so many factions within it that nobody can agree upon who the successor to my presidency is going to be. They're already fighting 2 years before the election over who gets to be the next president. And these factions are now personal. So, Henry Clay and John Calhoun and Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams, other candidates in 1824, they all basically were now launching personal attacks because they didn't have any principles to distinguish themselves from each other because they weren't part of the same party. So when you don't have elections about principles, you have to make it about the personality of the candidates you're opposing, which is a tremendous foreshadowing of what's going to happen in the 20th century. And so Monroe is lamenting all of this, and he says basically, I still think we can keep a one-party system in place, but We now have this horrible election that's going to last 2 years, and it's going to be really bitter and really about personality conflicts. And yeah, I think Monroe's concerns there are very similar to the ones we have today.
It's very similar. Anyone who's participated in a inter-party election will recognize that model, where since we all agree, nearly all of us agree on the platform of the party, by the standards of the world, we're all solid conservative Republicans. The differences between us become personalities. He's my friend, I'm voting for him. He's not my friend, I'm not voting for him. Or he offended me 20 years ago and I've never forgotten it. It becomes very personal, and it's not about the issues or the principles. And you definitely see that in 1824. And I will say this: there's in contrast to the modern era, you got to say this: James Monroe probably had the most presidential cabinet of any cabinet in history, in that any one of the members of his cabinet, I think all of them ran for president at some point, and all of them could have been president. They were all presidential material. I mean, you compare it to today, and remember, these men were picked in a highly restricted franchise, high Republican system. And I say high Republican in the sense that very few people had the vote, and there weren't even conventions back then. The party caucuses in Congress would get together and choose the nominee. But you had John Quincy Adams, one of America's best secretaries of state. You had him at the State Department. You had William Harris Crawford at the largely forgotten today, but very respected Georgian former senator and ambassador who served as Secretary of the Treasury. He ran for president in 1824. You had Calhoun, one of the best secretaries of war we've ever had. You had William Wirt, highly respected Virginia lawyer as Attorney General. Even Smith Thompson at the Navy Department, who's largely forgotten today, but he later served as a member of the Supreme Court, and he also wanted to run for president as the New York candidate of the Republicans. So you have these names, Calhoun, Adams. These are names that are very much respected today compared to our modern time. I mean, how many members of a typical presidential cabinet today would be seen as successors to the president? And right. These are all men picked under an extremely limited system, an extremely high Republican limited franchise system. Before we had Jacksonian democracy, you had Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, John Quincy Adams. By the standards of today, any one of those men would be considered a great president compared to, modern presidents. And even when the parties were strong, you had Martin Van Buren, who, even though he only served one term, was very successful implementing his agenda, even though he lost. And his stamp was left on the party for generations after him. The stamp of classical liberal, almost libertarian policies remained on the Democrat Party until 1896. The party Van Buren built lasted over a half a century. And you think today, by contrast to today, when we have weak parties and weak nominating systems, think about Ronald Reagan, the most influential Republican president or Republican figure of the 20th century. His influence, sadly, is far more superficial, because if you look at it, since Reagan left the scene, not a single Reaganite was nominated by the Republican Party until Donald Trump came along. And Trump was a supporter of Reagan in 1980, as a businessman and a donor, not an active politician. But after Reagan, not a single actual Reagan supporter in 1980 was nominated by the Republican Party until Donald Trump came along after 28 years. Not to mention the fact that the Republican Party continuously diverted from its Reaganite platform. And you compare that to Martin Van Buren, who, even though some people didn't like Van Buren personally in the party after he left office, his vision remained stamped on the Democrat Party. And for the next 50 years, 60 years really, more than that, Grover Cleveland, Samuel Tilden, Horatio Seymour, all these Democrats who ran for office, Stephen Douglas, basically adhered faithfully to the classical liberal, small government, hard money, gold standard platform that Van Buren had built. Was it because they loved the little magician from New York? No, it's because he built an organization which they needed in order to get elected. And I think that we could learn something from that today. It's the institution, as James Carville said, it's the economy, stupid. Well, I think modern conservatives could say it's who controls the nomination, stupid.
Mm-hmm.
You give me. I used to tell people, you give me the rule book and tell me who you want nominated, and I'll write the rules to make it happen. It's all in the rules.
Right. And we often think of that as sort of undemocratic and really problematic. And I think the most important thing we can understand about political parties and these rules that you're talking about is that it's not undemocratic to use a system to nominate candidates and to have people work within that system. There's a difference between having a system that creates an organization for nominating candidates and one that is an undemocratic organization. Like, parties were never in the 19th century undemocratic. The delegates were elected by the people who were members of the party. And so the parties responded, even if they responded slowly in a representative fashion rather than an immediately democratic fashion, they always responded to changes in their base. The Democratic Party became more activist in terms of the role of government as the party itself, the Democratic Party, became more composed of people who wanted that policy. Because parties always were organized to bring the will of the people into the deliberations of the convention. So the idea we have of the 19th century is that these were smoke-filled rooms. I actually think that is historically inaccurate. The parties, you can see them over and over again responding to changes in public opinion. No better example of this than the death of the Whig Party in the 1850s, when the slavery question became so important that compromise in the North on the slavery question was impossible. The party that wanted to compromise, the Whig Party, essentially had to either adapt and change and become an abolitionist party or die. And that's exactly what happened to the Whigs, and then a truly abolitionist party, the Republican Party, was born. So in spite of the fact that the parties had control over the nomination of their candidates, they always had to be knowledgeable and responsive to the wishes of the base of the party. So I think one of the most important things that history shows us about these parties is that they've always been responsive to the wishes of the people. They aren't these, sort of top-down organizations that just, nominate candidates in smoke-filled rooms. They really were always representative of the base of the party. And so, if we went back to that system, it's not like we would put the elites in charge and they would just ignore the people. They would always nominate candidates who are going to turn the base out, who are going to motivate the base to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about it, you also think about the cognitive dissonance, the two-faced nature of the argument about smoke-filled rooms. Particularly, in my experience here in Georgia, the people, the folks who oppose conventions with the greatest vigor are the ones who are what you might call the more moderate Republicans, the more established Republicans, and they're always the ones saying, well, we have to be bipartisan, we have to work together, we got to take half a loaf and such. And they're always getting together in the legislature, in the smoke-filled rooms, in the conference committees where they chop a good bill to bits and stick in a whole bunch of goodies for their donors. But on the one hand, they say, well, we can't have smoke-filled rooms. The people have to make the choice. And then they make the decision in smoke-filled rooms in the legislature and government, and there's no contradiction there at all. The people don't get to see it. The legislators don't even get to read the bill before they have to vote on it. So the hypocrisy there is not lost on me at all, and you see the same thing in Washington today. What you are suggesting would be very well received, I'm sure, by the House Freedom Caucus and by people like Senator Cruz and Senator Paul and Senator Lee. I'm sure Senator McConnell and Leader McCarthy would oppose it viciously, but they're the kind of guys who make deals in smoke-filled rooms now. So what's wrong with expanding the franchise of the smoke-filled room, so to speak, to the delegates from Des Moines and from Dubuque and Kansas City and so on? What's wrong with expanding that circle of influence a little? Because they don't think they'll object to smoke-filled rooms in principle. They just object to it when other people want to get in the room and start making deals too.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting point, and I think we might start to see how this plays out if this movement to sort of bring parties back into the picture gains momentum. Because one of the things that happened under the stronger party system was that the leaders had more power, meaning leaders in Congress, Speaker of the House and sort of the Senate, committee chairs and Senate Majority Leader. They always had more power when the parties were stronger because they had more loyalty from the rank and file members of the party. And one of the things you've seen over the last, say, 10 years is over and over again, especially among Republicans, weak party leaders, John Boehner and Paul Ryan being prime examples, who, they wanted to cut a deal on, say, especially on funding the government and preventing shutdowns. And they could never, even if they got the deal agreed upon, they could never get the votes from among their own party. So one of the interesting theses or hypotheses out there is, that if we had a stronger party system, that the leaders, meaning the sort of centrists inside the party, would appreciate that kind of a system. What you're suggesting is actually people who want that kind of a system are actually more of the base of the party, not the moderates, because then they would get more of a say in the deal-making process. Instead of having, say, John Boehner and Paul Ryan alone in a room cutting a deal, those leaders would have to actually involve all of the parts of the party in the deal-making process. And that's a really fascinating point. I think it's a really important point, because if you had that kind of a process of compromise, one in which the leaders of the party were truly representative of the whole party, then I think these deals would be a lot easier to make. And if those deals were easier to make, I think a lot of people would have a lot more confidence in the government, because you wouldn't see this sort of gridlock that we have today. So I think this is a really important point about restoring sort of responsible government inside Congress. And it would be really fascinating to see how this plays out. And hopefully we get to see that, because I think it'd be really healthy for the political system we have.
Well, you see, this is very true. And in theory, you would think that the elites would favor a more cerebral, disciplined convention system rather than the free-for-all of a primary. But in reality, wherever you see this in Utah, where Mitt Romney supporters are trying to get the conventions abolished in terms of nominating, we see this in every state around the nation. You can call your friends in Virginia, you can call your friends in Colorado, in Utah, in Iowa, in Nevada, any place where they have a caucus or convention, and ask them the more Mitch McConnell, John Boehner type Republicans, are they for greater caucus or convention influence or less? And to a man, they will be for less, because they are less organized and they have the money and the grassroots has the organization. In theory, you would think, yeah, they should favor that kind of deal-making system, but in reality, they don't. And I think that's another thing that you brought out in what you said is you have this fake, you have this, they say it's democratic, but it's not really. Democracy almost immediately degenerates into a demagogic dictatorship of the few who are behind the scenes pulling the strings. I mean, does anyone really believe that a typical election today is representative of the wishes of the people? I mean, does anyone think, we all talk about the swamp and the elites and draining the swamp. How is it any different now that billionaires are the new kingmakers than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago, when the son of an immigrant could become a wheeler and dealer in politics and could sit in party councils with the grandsons of men who had signed the Declaration of Independence and work together to hammer out a compromise representing his state and his interests? How is that system worse than a system today where a billionaire, be he Soros, Bloomberg, or David Koch, can make or break a candidate? How is that system worse?
Yeah, this is sort of the irony of what the progressives did in the early 20th century. So the real turning point in this whole question about parties was the early 20th century. And the paper for Heritage that I wrote goes into this some detail, but basically the progressives said that parties were the central sort of cornerstone of the undemocratic system we have, because they nominate the candidates instead of the people. And so what they said was, we want to make the system truly democratic, Therefore, let's put the people in charge of the nominating process by putting these primaries in place, circumventing the party conventions. And, they might have had good intentions. They might have said, well, we have an undemocratic system, and this reform is going to make the system more democratic. But what you see happening in practice is, contrary to their predictions about what would happen, they produced a deeply undemocratic system, one in which the people have very little influence and feeling of control over who the candidates are. And that's brought us to where we are today, where people don't really think that the system is responsive to them. This is great sort of paradox, is that the more democratic we made the nominating system, the less democratic it actually became in practice.
Or perhaps another way of putting it, the less representative it became in practice. But here's the good part. Your actual wishes will be implemented. In Georgia, for example, we do ballot questions, non-binding ballot questions, and it always comes back overwhelmingly conservative. Republican primary voters want the Ted Cruz's and Rand Paul's running our state government. But that platform is never implemented. So the question is, do you want your values implemented through a system where you may not have as much direct say, or do you want to have a vote, but it's meaningless because you lose everything once the people who lied to you get in power? You've got these swindlers come along and say, I'm going to do the conservative things. They don't. They get elected and they swindle you. It's uncomfortable at first to tell mom, hey, mom, maybe you need to stop driving, or you need to give me power of attorney. But long term, it's in the best interest. It's got short-term pain, long-term gain, versus what we have now is, we all get to vote, but nothing ever changes because because we're being swindled.
Yeah, we sort of reduce democracy to voting for things instead of actually having a government that implements the will of the people.
Well, exactly. The biggest lie we tell kids in school today is that the whole of your civic involvement consists of voting.
Right. Yeah.
I can't remember who said this, but it's not entirely true, but it's somewhat true, more true than we want to admit. If voting made a difference, they wouldn't let us do it.
I haven't heard that before, but that's a good sort of way of tying up what you just said in a short span.
Yes, sir. Well, I really appreciate the time you've given us.
Real pleasure talking with you about this, and really appreciate the time you've taken to read my work and to help promote it to the people who listen to you.
Where can folks go to learn more about the work you're doing? We'll post, by the way, your article for Heritage will be posted at the website, georgegaCaucus.com. It'll be at the top of the landing page for folks to read it. And where else can folks go to learn more about your work other than Amazon and Google? Put your name in there and buy your books.
Yeah, I would say probably just to sort of Google me and try to find things, sort of around the internet that I've done on this question. But one place in particular to look at is the Library of Law and Liberty, which is a place that I've done a lot of short writing about how parties can strengthen our democracy rather than make it weaker. The actual website of that, URL of that is lawliberty.org. Lawliberty.org, and just put my name in the Google function on that webpage, and I've got quite a bit of writing about this topic there.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, and I think my final charge to the folks listening is all we've discussed can only happen if you make it happen. Political movements in America don't just spring from the earth organically. Somebody behind the scenes lays the foundation. Someone has to put down that foundation on which we're going to build that house. And we are the change. We are the ones we've been waiting for, as President Obama used to say. If you want something to change, you need to do it yourself. So share this information with your friends, attend your convention next year, and start to make the incremental steps to restore our republic and make our party great again. I want to thank Dr. Postell for joining us today. And I wish him a very Merry Christmas, and wish everyone listening a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year this 21st day of December in the year of our Lord, 2018. God bless.